Hello, I'm Chipper Wichman, President and CEO of the National Tropical Botanical Garden. And today we're hosting a symposium entitled Agents of Change, the Role of Botanic Gardens in the 21st Century. This is one of the most relevant subjects for our communities and our societies because botanic gardens are uniquely positioned to address the subject of sustainability, the loss of biodiversity, where our food comes. With 7 billion people on our planet today, how we learn to live within the means of our environment without depleting the essential resources that our planet has is critical for ourselves and future generations. Botanic gardens are crucial to our communities and to our societies. They're safe places where people come to rest and recharge, to enjoy the beauty of plants. But even more than that, they are places where we can learn, we can engage people emotionally in the importance of plants. Without plants, our society as we know it today will cease to exist. Plants are the heart and lungs of our planet and control our climate systems, as well as provide us food and shelter and economic opportunity. Today, more than 80% of all biodiversity on Earth exists in the tropics, and today, 1/3 of all tropical plant species are threatened with extinction. Gardens are uniquely positioned to talk about this and to help the community and to build public will to preserve these plants for future generations.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for this meeting. I've been the director of this museum for 2 years, and it's an amazing place to be. We have the world's largest natural history collections, 127 million objects, over 400 PhDs doing research last year in 71 countries and publishing 700 papers. Last year naming 392 species. And on the front of the house, 7 million visitors, which means on a given day we might see 40 or 50,000 people in this informal science education venue, making it perhaps the most impactful public science venue in the world. It's the most visited museum in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the great things we have the ability to do here is to convene groups such as yourselves to talk about the details. And as a paleobotanist, I'm delighted to see you here because paleobotanists have a particular affinity for botanic gardens, which are themselves sort of living versions of the past, particularly here in North America where we can see the remains of the East Asian flora that used to live here growing in our botanic gardens and realize that they're a return of native species to their homeland, albeit 50 million years later. I was also mentored by Bill Klein, who, as you know, was first at the Morris Arboretum, then at the Fairchild, and then at the National Tropical Botanical Gardens, and we all mourn his earlier passing, but he gave me a lot of insights into leadership in the botanic garden realm and actually funded my first exhibit project ever, a small exhibit about fossil plants at the Morris Arboretum back in 1983. So with that introduction, it's really delightful for me to see you here, and I will now give you Chipper Wichman, who will kick off the symposium and have a great day. I'll be lurking in the back watching the whole thing, and enjoy your day. Thank you so much.
Good morning, or aloha, as we say in Hawaii. We're here today to convene some of the great leaders in the botanic garden world. It's really an amazing lineup. As I was thinking about the speakers that are going to be here today, it's fascinating to see how we bookend this symposium with two of the greatest botanists that are alive today on our planet, Peter Raven and Sir Ian Prance. And in between all of those two great individuals are a whole series of stellar academics and applied conservationists, botanical garden leaders who are here today to talk about the relevance of botanic gardens in the 21st century. The question I pose to all of you as we think about this topic this morning is it enough? Is it enough for our botanists to risk their lives to reach those last plants? Shown here is Steve Perlman, a field collector extraordinaire, reaching to hand pollinate one of the last Brighamia growing on the Napali coast. And yes, that's ocean 3,000 feet below him there. I don't show this to our risk management people. But Steve literally pushes himself to go where the hand of man has never set foot. But is that enough for us as institutions? Is it enough for us to have some of the most cutting-edge research facilities where we can better understand plants and how they function and how they can benefit mankind? Is it enough for us to build the state-of-the-art facilities to house our collections and to push the envelope? Shown here in the center is the first LEED certified building built on the island of Kauai. When NTBG built this facility, we challenged the construction industry in terms of how they reduce their footprint and impact, and it has transformed construction on our island and in Hawaii. Is it enough to explore some of the most remote islands in the world? Shown here are some of the areas where NTBG has spent over the past 4 decades work, and throughout the Pacific Islands, which are evolutionary engines, parts of the planet that are producing more species at a quicker rate than any other part on our planet. Is that enough? Is it enough to have the best collections curated and stored under archival conditions? Is it enough for us to just have these collections, to use them as research facilities? Is it enough to create some of those beautiful and compelling gardens in the world that are safe refuges for our communities to come and rest and recharge and be educated? These are challenging times, and I pose these questions to you because the role of botanic gardens has evolved tremendously since the time of World War II. Think about the impact of world population, and it took thousands and thousands of years for our planet to reach 1 billion people in 1820. In just 140 years, we tripled it to 3 billion people. In 1960, following World War II, the map of the world was reset, and the population of the world began growing even more rapidly. And within 40 years, we added another 3 billion people to our planet. And in another 50 years, we'll be approaching or exceeding 9 billion people if the growth continues at the rate that's being projected. This has put incredible stresses on our planet for food security, where much of the world is still depending upon relatively primitive ways to produce food. Cultural security. Are the indigenous people, cultures, and languages secure in this climate with billions and billions of people on our planet? Energy security are huge issues that are driving greenhouse gases and driving the equilibrium that our planet exists in. And of course, biosecurity, which is right at the sweet spot of where botanical gardens operate. These are huge challenges and issues. And I would argue that we, as a generation sitting here today, are faced with one of the greatest extinction crises the planet has seen. These images represent a snapshot of the biodiversity that's at risk. Should we not act as agents of change? Should we not conduct compelling programs and engage the hearts and minds and political will of the larger community? I would argue that what we have done up to now is not enough, that in fact we need to think outside of the box. And I can remember the first time I showed up at the Eden Project with Ian Prance, and I saw this sculpture called Wichman. And we have talked and talked and talked about the throwaway society we live in, about the waste electronics that we're generating. And when I stood there and saw a life-size Tyrannosaurus Rex made up of waste electronic equipment that one person will throw away in their lifetime, it blew my mind. It connected to me in a way that was beyond anything I'd ever seen before. That's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that botanic gardens need. It's outside of the box for people like Dr. Diane Rigoni, who will chair a session today, to think about a plant which we collected, to conserve it, to do the normal comfort zone work that botanic gardens do, to create an ex situ conservation collection, to study it and think about taking this collection and using it to solve world hunger. That's the kind of out-of-the-box change agent thinking that we need. The World Conservation Congress of the IUCN sets the global conservation agenda. In the 70-year history of IUCN, that World Congress has never been in the United States. 2 botanic garden leaders, myself and Christopher Dunn from Lion Arboretum, decided it was time to change that. This was not easy. But on May 21st, the IUCN Council voted unanimously to not only bring it into the U.S., but to host it in Hawaii in September 2016. I hope you'll all be there. The world needs us to be relevant, to be engaging, to be fearless. The world needs us to be agents of change, pushing the limits of what is currently being done to secure the biodiversity and cultural diversity of our planet. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to open our symposium today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Peter Raven. This is my 38th year working at the National Tropical Botanical Garden. Peter has been one of our a member of our scientific advisory group from the early 70s. So most of in fact, all of my botanical career, I've grown up admiring Peter essentially as a mentor and an incredible leader. He's one of the great individuals who truly represents an agent of change. Peter, thank you for joining us this morning.
It's very fun to be back in this auditorium where, as some of you may know, we held the symposium in 1987 that Ed Wilson organized for the National Academy of Sciences and the Smithsonian on biological diversity. And actually, the word biodiversity was coined in the publication that resulted from that symposium. I remember being here with Alice Waters on a later occasion, talking about foods and genetic modification and all sorts of things, and it's really a venerable setting for meetings of this kind. Now, it's very interesting to think about the charter for the National Tropical Botanical Garden in 1964, following discussions between a committee for a Hawaiian botanical garden that started in the late 50s. It's very interesting to think of 1964, the charter, then all the work that went to selecting the site in Kauai finally, and then William Stewart coming to the NTBG and PTBG then in 1970 and being director to 75. Mildred Mathias, who was one of my mentors, and also Bill Theobald, who many of you knew was her student. Mildred Mathias was a woman who was greatly ahead of her time. She got her PhD in 1922 from the Missouri Botanical Garden. In 1929, at the time she was 22 years old, and was really a path breaker in the field of women in science. One of the interesting things about Mildred Mathias is that I took her on her first trip to Latin America, which seems almost impossible since she made most of her career there later. But in 1957, when I was 21 years old and she was 50, we set out for Baja California, and it was the first time she'd been south of the border. She then spent about 25 years working in Latin America and taking trips there and doing pharmacological botany and all the rest. Quite amazing. Last year we celebrated, and this kind of sets the stage for this, for the time, we celebrated the 50th anniversaries of the Organization of Tropical Studies and the Association for Tropical Biology, which was fostered here at the Smithsonian and which then came to be called the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation in San Jose, Costa Rica. Not surprisingly, Mildred was a prime figure in both of those, in the founding of both of those organizations and in the founding of the National Tropical Botanical Garden. She was the only woman member on the committee. The other people on the committee were, for example, Dick Howard, Peter Ashton, Ray Fosberg, Sir George Taylor, Bill Stern. But Mildred was the only woman. In 1967, they met and started the ball rolling towards organizing this garden before Stewart came there in 1970. I knew about this. I was a graduate student from UCLA who got my PhD in 1960. And a lot of us were in biology in those days who came forward with some of these innovations and some of these activities in tropical biology and biology generally. Ian Prance, Tom Lovejoy. Dillon Ripley was chairman of the Smithsonian from 64 to 84. And if you then look back and think about what was going on then, people in the United States were really becoming aware of the tropics and anxious to have a role in the tropics. It was natural that Hawaii would be a site for a lot of their interest, since Hawaii was early associated with the United States, and at about the same time that Presidents McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt took the United States on a somewhat imperialistic path at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, Hawaii became a part of the United States. As Mark Twain put it, Hawaii is the loveliest fleet of islands that lies anchored in any ocean, which is kind of a wonderful quote. My grandfather went to Honolulu in 1900. My father was born there in 1906, and so I feel I have some association in that way, even though when I talk to the Cooks about that, they point out that their ancestors got there in 1837, which Amos Starr Cook was apparently a great guy who started as a missionary but later became a land grabber, and resulted in, and his advice to the Hawaiian royalty and all resulted in increasing influence by the United States and eventually to the various, to the annexation and eventually to the statehood of Hawaii. If you look backward, European powers were very concerned with the tropics, obviously, well before, I mean, from about 100 years after Columbus, when the Dutch, the English, and the French were reaching out to various tropical parts of the world. One example, or the Spanish, obviously, one example would be Jose Celestino Mutis, who went out to Bogota from Spain in 1761, and out there chartered one of the finest sets of illustrations of plants that's ever been made using a whole series of artists. Those beautiful paintings can be seen in the Jardín Real Botánico de Madrid, and they are some of the most beautiful paintings ever made. And what they reflected was a desire to know about the tropical lands. And of course, Britain did the same thing and so forth. And Kew established a whole series of gardens around its possessions in the tropics, and in those gardens were grown plants that they hoped would be commercially valuable in the various places where they operated. But although America had a few expeditions to tropical places in the 19th century, we had very little and no territorial interest. Eventually, what led us to the time of McKinley and Roosevelt was the economic expansion that took place after the Civil War, over the several decades after the Civil War. And when we entered the 20th century, then we were already beginning to look all around the world. If you look at the whole picture biologically, of course, people were always interested in the tropics, but it's interesting to note that at the time of Linnaeus, in the middle of the 18th century, it was thought that the flora of the tropics would be kind of homogeneous because the specimens that he had and that other people had were largely gathered in the vicinity of seaports around the tropics and tended to be similar wherever they were being collected. It wasn't until Alexander von Humboldt carried out his very significant travels and his expedition in the tropics from 1799 to 1803 that we had any idea of the incredible richness that laid there. Actually, in the early 70s, I was asked by the National Science Foundation to convene a meeting on targets in systematic and evolutionary biology, and I did that. We had a very large committee. And one of the findings that we had was that tropical biology was indispensable, had to be studied, or we'd never have comparisons for what we were learning about temperate biota at the same time. During the course of the 1970s, Bill Sievers first sent Don Duckworth and me to Hawaii to look at the state of the Bishop Museum at that time, And by the end of the decade, he asked me to convene a study of tropical biology. He said, okay, your committee said it would be great to know about tropical biology. Now, what exactly should we do? Well, we convened a meeting, a study, and one of the first things we did was hire Norman Myers, who traveled all over the tropical world, finding out about the state of destruction in the tropics and finding out that it was much worse than anybody had imagined up to that time, so that the point we were making in the early 70s about needing to know about the tropics was particularly backed up by his study. One of the things that came out of our study was that there were about twice as many species in the tropics in any well-known group as there were in temperate regions. And if you looked at the whole of biology, there were only about half as many species known from the tropics in the 1970s as there were from temperate regions, which meant that instead of an estimate of 2 million species of eukaryotes, non-bacteria in the world, it was more reasonable to think of 3 or 4 million species, as I sort of figured out in the course of that study and published. Soon Terry Irwin of this institution was pointing out that there might be tens of millions of species in the tropics. And although the estimates, the conventional estimates now are somewhat lower, it was a whole lot richer than anybody ever imagined. A few people like Merrill, Robbins, Bassett, McGuire got going in tropical botany before World War II, but the big explosion was after World War II, when people began thinking of founding a tropical botanical garden, among other things, a Pacific botanical garden. Senator Inouye was very important both in the original chartering of the garden and also in the changing the name to National Tropical Botanical Garden in 1988 after the acquisition of the Kampong. But the goals and principles and pursuits of the National Tropical Botanical Garden remain about the same, focused on the Pacific area, with occasional work elsewhere, as dictated by interest in particular groups of plants. It's very important to notice that, to then change gears and talk about conservation. Americans had been very interested in conservation before World War II, in fact, going back to colonial days, but what their interest in conservation was largely based on was the destruction of forests in the West and the desire to keep them for posterity, and their desire for sustainability, conservation, or whatever you might call it today, was also spurred by the many immigrants who are coming into the urban areas of the United States and living in squalid slums that were completely unacceptable for human habitation. But conservation, in the sense that we think of it now, really didn't get going until the early 1960s in any strong way, when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out, when Dave Brower, then the head of the Sierra Club, published This is the American Earth, and when people began to think more coherently about conservation as such. And certainly the National Tropical Botanical Garden, when it was founded, just in the early 60s, just as when, for example, Surian and I and others began our own professional careers, although Paul Richards, who wrote a book on tropical forests that all of us studied as graduate students, warned that some cutting was going on pretty rapidly, still we didn't really think of our biology, our inventory work, as something that would be affected greatly by the loss of species in the immediate future. It wasn't until, well, in 1969, Kew published the first red list of plants, and things went on from there. We got more and more interested in conservation as the garden developed, as the National Tropical, Pacific Tropical and National Tropical Botanical Garden developed, and things went forward. And so what had begun as a kind of inventory or gathering plants into gardens in the same sense that had been traditional for 150 years, became tied up with the idea of conservation. And it's particularly fitting and interesting and wonderful that the IUCN is meeting in Hawaii in the United States for the first time in a couple of years. And congratulations to Chipper and Chris for their wonderful work in bringing that about. When the Congressional Charter for what was then the Pacific Tropical Botanical Garden was issued, and Chipper has already alluded to this, but it's interesting to lay it out on the framework of the history of the institution whose anniversary we're celebrating today. There were 3.3 billion people in the world in 1964. There's 7.2 billion people in the world now. So the world population has more than doubled in the 50 years of existence of the National Tropical Botanical Garden. The population of the United States has gone from 192 to 320 million during that period, and the population of Hawaii has gone from 800,000 people to 1.4 million. When you consider that demand for consumption by all of those people has been rocketing up much more rapidly than their numbers, then you can understand why the pressure they put on the environment have led to the evident losses in environmental stability all over the world, because it's not only population numbers, but it's consumption, and it's the use of technologies which often were very good when they were started, but which turn out to be harmful when they're used by large numbers of people in unanticipated quantity. What is particularly disturbing about the world now can be expressed by pointing out that of the 7 billion people who are here, about 1 billion are malnourished, and of those 1 billion, about 100 million are on the verge of starvation at any given time. Furthermore, if you look at the website Footprint Network, .org, put out by the Global Footprint Network, a think tank in Oakland, California, you can see, and it's demonstrated very clearly in that whereas in 1970 we were using about 70% of the world's sustainable productivity, in 2014 we're using about 160% of the world's sustainable productivity, which means that following August of each year, we're eating into the principles, so to speak, for sustainability rather than living off the interest. No wonder that so many huge tracts of tropical forest have been destroyed. No wonder that the habitats are changing all over the world. And quite importantly, if you think about the relationship between nations, the idea that Gro Harlem Brundtland had in her 87 report, Our Common Future, that all countries all over the world would come up to the standards of the United States and Western Europe in their ability to consume, is a sad farce, because there's not enough productivity in the world to allow them to do that. Human beings evolved into the living world 12,000 years ago when crop agriculture was started, presumably in Turkey. 12,000 years ago, the whole human population of the world, after over 2 million years of the existence of human beings on Earth, amounted to 1 million people on all the continents, North and South America, Africa, Eurasia, Australia combined. Now it amounts to 7.2 billion people just 12,000 years later, with agriculture of one kind or another occupying about a third of the world's land surface, and agriculture being a serious detriment to biodiversity. If you think about cultivating or grazing a third of the world's surface, you can see what huge amounts of extinction followed from that. And if you know the history, for example, of birds in the Pacific or in Hawaii particularly, you can see small examples of it right there. We're at a time when the beauty, diversity, and wonder of the world is moving downhill, when it will never be quite as good with quite as much freedom as there is now. But we're also at a time when every action we take, every action that you take individually, and every action that that the National Tropical Botanical Garden takes with your interest and everything you do about sustainability, all of that, taking it into account, reining it in, doing better, getting together in groups, thinking imaginatively about how to inspire people, making the United States and Western Europe as international as possible, living conservative lives in terms of consumption, and learning about and wondering about and publicizing the fantastic life with which we share this earth, that all of that is a great opportunity now, that what we do presented as good stories, good information for people, all of the careers that we undertake learning about it, and anything we can do to promote moral lives, understanding lives, and coordinated lives throughout the world will contribute substantially to the condition of the world in the future. Projections of population are starting to range up to 13 billion people now in the 21st century. It's no longer considered likely or feasible that the population may stabilize at all, even though we're way beyond what the Earth can support. But again, we can do a lot about it. Understanding people can change the future of the Earth. You are and we are understanding people, and I would only echo the words of Chipper in that we have an obligation, we have a wonderful opportunity to do something about it. I'm delighted to be a part of this conference and to endorse the wonderful work of the National Tropical Botanical Garden over the first 50 years, and to join Chipper's challenge that it should do much better over the next 50 years, starting right now. Thank you very much.